Any combat pilots here? The question, sharp and laced with the casual arrogance of youth, sliced through the sterile air of the museum auditorium. Captain Davis, USMC, paced before the small assembly of junior officers, his posture a study in sculpted confidence. His jaw was firm, his uniform immaculate, his boots polished to a black mirror that reflected the overhead lights. He was the archetype of the modern warrior, molded by simulators and strategic theory, eager to impart his hard-won wisdom. His gaze swept across the faces before him, young, eager, overwhelmingly male, and dismissed the periphery. He was looking for a kindred spirit, a brother of the sky, someone who could validate his next point about the visceral reality of G-force and target acquisition. His eyes skimmed past the back row, barely registering the small, elderly woman sitting quietly beside a teenage girl. She was a ghost in his periphery, a civilian anomaly in a room dedicated to the future of Marine Corps aviation. Her tweed jacket was dated, her silver hair pinned in a simple bun. She was utterly invisible to him, a relic in a hall of titans, as inconsequential as the dust motes dancing in the projector beam. The silence stretched, and a smirk touched the captain's lips. No one. Not surprising. It's a rare breed. He turned back to his presentation, a holographic F-35 shimmering behind him. The point, gentlemen, is that the experience of a combat pilot is something you cannot learn from a book. It is a language of instinct, of violence, of feeling the airframe scream around you as you push it to its absolute limit. It is a man's world, a world of calculated aggression. He gestured to the shimmering jet. This machine is the apex predator of the modern battlefield, but it's the soul of the warrior inside that makes it lethal. In the back row, Evelyn Reed sat perfectly still. Her hands, gnarled with age but immaculately clean, rested in her lap. She heard the words, man's world, warrior, aggression, and felt no anger, only a profound and ancient weariness. The hum of the room's ventilation system was a low drone, and for a fleeting moment, it wasn't conditioned air she heard, but the throaty roar of a Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double WASP engine, the violent, shuddering symphony of a corsair straining to break free of the earth. Her granddaughter, Sarah, shifted beside her, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, the subtle condescension in the captain's tone. A few rows ahead, a man watched Evelyn not as a relic, but as a puzzle. Retired Sergeant Major Frank Miller had not come for the lecture. He had come to see the newly restored Dauntless dive bomber. But he knew the posture of a soldier. He had seen it for 30 years, in jungles and deserts, in parade grounds and field hospitals. It was a stillness that wasn't passive, a quiet that wasn't empty. It was the coiled repose of someone who had faced down chaos and found their center within it. And he saw something else. On the lapel of her worn tweed jacket was a small, tarnished silver pin. It wasn't a medal he recognized, not a standard-issue decoration. It was a pair of delicate wings with a shield in the center, an artifact so obscure he had to squint to make it out. His mind, a repository of military insignia and forgotten history, began to churn. He had seen that pin once before, in a dusty photograph in a Paris Island archive, on the collar of a woman standing proudly before a hulking B-26 Marauder, a plane they called the Widowmaker. He leaned forward slightly, his focus shifting entirely from the preening captain at the front to the silent, stoic woman in the back. The lecture continued, a cascade of technical jargon and self-aggrandizing anecdotes. Captain Davis, now fully in his element, decided to engage his audience with a Socratic flourish. His eyes roamed the room, seeking a target for his intellectual exercise. They landed on Sarah, Evelyn's granddaughter, whose youthful uncertainty made her the perfect foil. "You, young lady," he said, his voice dripping with paternalistic indulgence. "Let's talk about dogfighting theory. Tell me, what is the primary challenge in achieving a firing solution on a maneuvering target in a high-G environment?" Sarah froze, her face flushing crimson. The question was a technical ambush, designed not to elicit an answer, but to demonstrate her ignorance. She stammered, I don't know, sir. The speed." The captain chuckled, a soft, dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet room. "The speed, yes. But it's more than that. It's about leading the target, about understanding energy states, about... Well, it's complicated. It was at that moment that a new voice entered the conversation. It was quiet, yet it carried the clarity of a bell. It was the torque, Evelyn said, her voice raspy with disuse but perfectly steady. Every head turned. Captain Davis paused, his condescending smile faltering. "I'm sorry," he asked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Evelyn's gaze was fixed on him, not with defiance, but with the simple authority of fact. "On the early Corsairs," she elaborated, her voice gaining a subtle strength. "The torque from the engine was so powerful it would flip an inexperienced pilot on takeoff. You didn't fight it with strength. You had to feel it. You had to dance with it. That was the primary challenge. Staying alive long enough to get airborne." The room was silent. The specificity of her statement was jarring. Captain Davis recovered quickly, his ego reasserting itself. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "An enthusiast. Wonderful. Ma'am, you've clearly read a book or two. But with all due respect, reading about it and living it are two very different things." The captain saw not a correction, but a challenge. His authority, so carefully constructed, had been pricked by a grandmother's historical trivia. He decided this minor insurrection needed to be quashed, publicly and decisively. He strode down the aisle, his polished boots clicking ominously on the floor, stopping directly in front of Evelyn's chair. He loomed over her, a symbol of institutional power confronting a perceived irrelevance. "Ma'am," he began, his voice taking on a tone of feigned concern. "This is a restricted seminar for active-duty Marine Corps personnel. It's a professional development event. We discuss matters of national security, of combat readiness." He let the words hang in the air, their implication clear. "You do not belong here." "Perhaps," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the museum's main entrance, "the civilian exhibits would be more your speed. I believe there's a lovely display on flight attendant uniforms from the 1960s. The insult was as sharp as it was petty. Several of the young officers chuckled nervously. Sarah shrank in her seat, humiliated for her grandmother. Evelyn, however, did not flinch. Her expression remained unchanged, her gaze steady. It was this stillness, this absolute refusal to be diminished, that seemed to enrage the captain further. "Security," he called out, his voice now hard-edged. "Could we please escort this woman and her granddaughter out?" They seemed to be lost. A young guard, no older than Sarah, approached with hesitant steps, his uniform ill-fitting and his face a mask of youthful insecurity. He was clearly uncomfortable, caught between the captain's command and the quiet dignity of the old woman before him. Sergeant Major Miller, watching from a few rows away, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen this brand of institutional arrogance before, and it always ended poorly. He discreetly pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a number he hadn't dialed in years, a direct line to a man who did not tolerate disrespect to the uniform, past or present. The young guard reached them, his hand hovering awkwardly near Evelyn's elbow. "Ma'am," he mumbled, his eyes darting away from her face. I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." It was the moment of crisis, the apex of the humiliation. The entire room watched, a tableau of youthful arrogance, institutional indifference, and quiet, unyielding strength. And then, slowly, deliberately, Evelyn Reed stood up. She was not tall, and age had stooped her shoulders slightly, but as she rose, a palpable authority filled the space around her. She was no longer just an old woman. She was a presence. She ignored the guard completely. Her eyes, the pale blue of a winter sky, locked onto Captain Davis. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it possessed a resonant power that silenced every whisper in the room. "You asked a question, Captain," she stated, the words not an inquiry, but a judgment. The captain, thrown off balance by her sudden transformation, could only scoff. "Yes, I did," he sneered, crossing his arms. "I asked for combat pilots. I was looking for warriors who have actually seen the inside of a hostile sky. Not history buffs." The final, dismissive term hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Behind them, Sergeant Major Miller pressed the call button on his phone. The line connected almost instantly. "Thorne," a gruff voice answered. Miller spoke in a low, urgent tone, his words clipped and precise. "General, it's Frank Miller. You need to get to the Air and Space Annex main auditorium." Now there was a pause. "What is it, Sergeant Major?" "Sir," Miller said, his eyes never leaving Evelyn. "They're dishonoring a WASP." One of the originals, the silence on the other end of the line was more potent than any shout. Then, simply, "I'm 5 minutes out," the line went dead. The heavy oak doors at the back of the auditorium burst open with a resounding crack, swinging inward with a force that made the room gasp. They didn't just open, they were thrown aside, as if by a great and righteous wind. Two Marines in full dress blues, their white gloves stark against the dark wood, flanked the entrance like sentinels. They snapped to a rigid parade rest, their faces impassive granite. Between them strode a figure whose very presence seemed to alter the gravitational pull of the room. General Marcus Thorne was a man carved from the bedrock of the Marine Corps. Stars glittered like constellations on the shoulders of his uniform, but it was the cold, controlled fury in his eyes that commanded absolute attention. Captain Davis, who had been basking in the glow of his petty victory, froze mid-smirk. His body, trained by years of reflex, snapped to the position of attention, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. "General," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Sir, I wasn't aware you were on base." General Thorne's gaze swept over the young captain, as if he were a piece of lint on the carpet. He offered no acknowledgement, no reply. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, scanned the room, searching. They passed over the junior officers, over the bewildered security guard, and then they found her. They locked onto Evelyn Reed, and in that instant, the fury in his expression melted away, replaced by something else entirely, a profound and unmistakable reverence. The four-star general, commander of all Marine Corps aviation, began to walk, his steps measured and deliberate, each footfall a drumbeat of impending judgment. The room held its breath. The air grew thick with unspoken history. General Thorne did not slow his pace until he was standing directly in front of Evelyn, the toes of his gleaming shoes just inches from hers. He was a mountain of a man, his shadow falling over her small frame. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking down at her, his expression unreadable. Then, in a single, fluid motion that was the culmination of a lifetime of discipline, he brought his heels together with an audible click and raised his hand to his brow. It was not a casual gesture. It was a salute of such precision, such crisp and solemn formality, that it seemed to sanctify the very air around them. It was the salute a warrior gives to a monarch, the salute a student gives to a master. It was an act of pure, unadulterated respect. He held it, his arm ramrod straight, his gaze locked with hers. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, a crushing weight of astonishment. Captain Davis's jaw hung open, his face ashen. The junior officers stared, their minds struggling to process the scene. The world had just been turned upside down. "Ma'am," the general's voice boomed, a parade ground command filled with an emotion that sounded like awe. "Colonel Reed, it is an honor to be in your presence." He held the salute, his eyes unwavering. "Colonel?" The word ricocheted through Captain Davis's mind, a stray bullet of incomprehensible information. He looked from the four-star general to the old woman in the tweed jacket, and for the first time, he saw her. He saw the steel in her spine, the history in her eyes, and a terrifying chasm of his own ignorance opened up beneath him. This was not a lost civilian. This was someone the system had forgotten, but whom history itself had not dared to. Lowering his hand with the same deliberate precision, General Thorne remained at the position of attention before Evelyn. He turned his head slightly, just enough to fix Captain Davis with a glare that was colder and sharper than any weapon the young officer had ever trained with. "Captain," the general began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency that promised retribution. "You asked this assembly if there were any combat pilots in the room." He paused, letting the captain's own words become a noose around his neck. "You are standing in the presence of not just a pilot, Captain. You are in the presence of a legend. This is Colonel Evelyn Reed, United States Air Force, retired. Before that, she was Evelyn Reed, Women Air Force Service Pilot, class of 1943. The general's voice was a lesson in living history, each word a hammer blow against the captain's smug certainty. "These women," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the young officers, "flew every single type of aircraft in the Army Air Force's arsenal. You want to talk about combat? This woman flew planes that had been repaired after suffering battle damage. She flew B-26 Marauders, planes so notoriously difficult to fly that male pilots refused to get in them. She flew P-51 Mustangs, shepherding them across the country to ports where they would be shipped to the real men's world in Europe. She towed targets behind her aircraft for live-fire anti-aircraft practice. Your predecessors, Captain, honed their gunnery skills by shooting at a drogue sleeve being pulled by this woman, hoping their aim wasn't off. She flew through blizzards, through thunderstorms, with no radar, no navigation aids beyond a map on her knee and a compass on the dash. She flew without the promise of a uniform, a rank, or a flag on her coffin. The general took a step closer to Captain Davis, his voice rising with a righteous fury that had been simmering for decades. You stand here in your climate-controlled room, with your holographic displays and your talk of calculated aggression, and you dare to lecture on the nature of a warrior? You, who have never had to wonder if the plane you were flying was structurally sound after being riddled with flak? You, who have never had to land a B-17 with 2 engines out and a third on fire? His voice resonated with the weight of forgotten sacrifice. 38 of her sisters in the WASP program died in service to this country. They died in training accidents, in ferry flights, in the line of a duty that their own government refused to officially recognize. When they were killed, the military did not even pay for their caskets or the transport to send their bodies home to their families. Their fellow pilots had to pass a hat to make sure their fallen sisters could be buried. They were not granted veteran status until 1977, more than 30 years after their service. They fought for their country in the sky, and then they had to fight their own government for decades just for the simple dignity of being called a veteran. He turned his thunderous gaze back to the young captain, who now looked physically ill. You asked for a combat pilot. The woman you attempted to humiliate and eject from this room has forgotten more about courage, sacrifice, and pure stick-and-rudder skill than you will ever know. You are not fit to polish her boots. He then turned back to Evelyn, his entire demeanor softening instantly. Colonel Reed, he said, his voice thick with emotion. On behalf of the United States Marine Corps, I offer you our most profound apology for the ignorance and gross disrespect you have been shown here today. Captain Davis stood frozen, a statue of shame. The general's words had stripped him bare, peeling away the layers of rank and ego, leaving only a raw, trembling boy. He opened his mouth, a desperate apology forming on his lips, but before he could speak, Evelyn raised a hand. It was a simple, gentle gesture, yet it carried an authority that silenced the 4-star general and the entire room. Her eyes were not on the general, they were fixed on the young captain, and in them, there was no malice, no triumph, only a deep, sorrowful wisdom. Son, she said, her voice reclaiming its quiet strength. Honor isn't in the uniform you wear. It is in how you wear it. Respect isn't a right of your rank. It is a debt you earn with your character. She let the lesson settle into the stunned silence. She then turned her gaze to the general, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. Thank you, Marcus. It's good to see you're still frightening the children. A flicker of a smile crossed the general's face. Only when they deserve it. Evelyn's gaze softened as she looked back at the shattered young captain. He's just a boy, she said, her voice now almost a whisper, meant for the general but heard by all. They're all just boys. They need to learn that the history they study was paid for by real people. That's all, with a final, almost imperceptible nod to Captain Davis, a gesture of grace that was more profoundly humbling than any formal punishment could ever be. She turned and took her granddaughter's hand. Come, Sarah, let's go get some ice cream. As she walked toward the exit, Sergeant Major Frank Miller rose silently to his feet. One by one, then all at once, every junior officer in the room followed his lead, rising in a wave of spontaneous, awestruck respect. General Thorne's voice cut through the air like a blade. Room 10 hut. Every Marine snapped to attention. As Evelyn Reed, Colonel, Pioneer, and Forgotten Hero, walked through the doors and disappeared from view, they held their salute, honoring not an order, but a legacy. The holographic F-35 still shimmered on the screen, a monument to the future, but the true lesson of that day had come from the distant, thundering past.